Tony D and Little Joan in the background with some extra videos tonight. Catching up on the weekend where I kind of dropped the ball. It was a busy weekend. Busy. One of the things, so this is a screenwriter, well, it's a writer's tip. Yeah, you could apply it to screenwriting or any kind of writing, really. So we're going to talk about research a little bit. So I found myself for book 19 of the Pineys researching a very specific time in the history of South Jersey, and that was the history of 1989. So we're going to talk about it. Smash like and subscribe. Thank you for smash liking and subscribing. Check out my books, The Pineys. You want to see the previous book? There it is. The Piney from Squankum, book 18. Available at Amazon.com. Don't forget, Kindle Unlimited is free. So, yeah, the next book, I can't tell you the title yet, but it does take place mostly in 1989. And so, in order to do the research, it's actually, I think, in some respects, a little harder to do the research for something relatively recent. I mean, it feels more recent to me because I'm 59 and I remember 1989, which is a good thing because my memory helped me a lot. Because, that was a time for me, like 1989. What was I? I was 23. And so, as you get older, some of the time periods in your life kind of blur together because they were boring. But 23 was kind of like, I'd been out of college for a year, so things were happening. I moved to LA right around that time, and so there was a lot of stuff going on. But the interesting thing about researching the time period to set a story there, unlike things, for instance, like the Revolutionary War. Like researching the Revolutionary War, that was easy, comparatively speaking. There's a lot of information on the Revolutionary War. There's just tons of it everywhere. There's tons of books. There are websites dedicated to various battles, and you can sort through all kinds of crazy information. I mean, I had way too much information for book 17, quite frankly. But when you talk about a time period like 1989, it's relatively recent, and it's right before the internet really kicked in. I think it was about 92 when I got on the internet and really started doing stuff. It was kind of percolating in 89, but wasn't a major factor. And a lot of people who didn't live in that era kind of don't understand it. And I've talked about that in some of my videos. So if you're a young person, you don't really understand the time before the internet. It was very different. The time before cell phones was very different too. Kind of overlaps a lot. And so, for instance, in the Pineys, in some of the modern stories, you'll see that the characters often coordinate with their cell phones, right? And they'll call each other or say, "Hey, I'm over here. Come over here." In 1989, you can't do that. You just can't do that. If you didn't have somebody's, and I explained this to one of my younger relatives one time, the concept of phones was different, right? The concept of a phone now is you have your phone with you at all times, right? But the concept prior to the cell phone was the phone was part of a house, right? Because it was a landline, and it was like the washing machine and the dryer. You couldn't remove the phone and run around with it, although, 89, they had the early cell phones, but most people didn't have one. They weren't everywhere. A guy like Donald Trump might have had one, but that was about it. And so you had to go into a house or use a payphone or go into some kind of edifice to use the phone. That's what a phone booth was for. You'll notice they're all gone and all the payphones are gone. And, or you don't notice because you've never seen a payphone in your life, but it was a different time that way. So that changes the dynamic of how the characters act. They can't just reach someone like that every time. So that's an issue in the story, or it became one. I realized they're like, oh yeah, now that was part of my own memory of that time. But a lot of people who didn't live during that time, they kind of had to suss that out on their own. You know, it wasn't easy to call someone on a landline. That was kind of the point, right? You know, sometimes not so much me, but some of people my age will, we just won't have our cell phones with us. You know, sometimes I'll go outside and mow the lawn or whatever. I don't have my cell phone in my pocket. I just leave it in the house because I don't want to carry it all sweaty. And, you know, somebody will call me and then I'll call them back later and they'll get annoyed, like, where the hell were you? As if I'm at their beck and call to answer the phone. That was a thing back in the day. You would call somebody and they weren't home. I mean, you might be able to leave a message if they had an answering machine, and they might get back to you that day. Maybe. Typically, they didn't. Typically, they waited till the next day, or they just didn't want to talk to you. They might say, oh, I didn't get that message. You know, if they weren't home for a few days, you might not talk to them for, 4 or 5 days. And I forget about it, and you see them again. Hey, you didn't call me. Oh, I forgot. These days, of course, you call someone to leave a voicemail and they don't call you back. You're kind of like, what the hell, man? I hope you were busy. So a different time period. Now, doing the research, I came to a point in the story where I needed to find a heavy object that would have been out in public at the time. And so I looked at the pictures of the town during that time. It's a fairly famous town in South Jersey, a fairly old one. So they did have pictures, but I needed pictures that were specifically 1989, right? I couldn't use, for instance, pictures from, say, even as late as 1990 and 90. That would have been too early. The 90s would have been too early. It had to be 89, where I had to be sure that whatever I was using on the street was there in 89. So I looked at pictures in the town, and I eventually figured out, oh yeah, initially I thought of cement barriers, right? There are cement barriers you will see used in construction, used to block certain paths. They have a particular look to them. I assume they're mass produced in some factory somewhere these days. And they have special trucks now that they just put them right out, and then they can come along and scoop them right up. They have a special grabber that it just goes up a ramp and then it automatically loads up onto the truck. They didn't have those in 89. So in 89, if you wanted to block a road, they were still using a lot of wooden roadblock things. Maybe they'd put up one of those big, heavy plastic, you see them in construction. They're round. They have like 2 lights on the top, something like that. But they didn't, I don't think they started doing the barriers of the kind I'm thinking of. They were pretty rare in 89. They were, at that point, probably too expensive to make, or they hadn't really thought of making them yet. Kind of wasn't necessary. I know they did have cement medium barriers, but those were more permanent. These are the temporary ones I'm talking about. So I couldn't use those. So eventually I figured out they did have, and they still do today, although they got rid of most of them, cement park benches, right? Like the seat is wood, but the part that holds the boards is cement. So I ended up using that. And that worked out fine. But and then the businesses in this town, I had to be careful about mentioning certain businesses, for every building or business that I mentioned, I had to be sure it was there in '89, right? So in this town, there was a couple of historic buildings. There's a couple of historic restaurants. Some are gone. I mentioned some of the ones that are now gone. A lot of them have closed in recent memories, and some that I just remembered. But one of the invaluable tools that I used, which I talk about in my talks sometimes, is a website called historicaerials.com. Now, what they do is they take Google Maps and they layer them in any part of the country. I don't know about overseas, but any part of the country, they'll layer the Google Maps by year, and they line up the streets and everything. So what you can do during the time of Google is you can compare year to year where roads were or are no longer there, if they did, major changes. So if you need to look at an old road from, the 2000s, early 2000s, you could see it. Now, prior to the Google and Google Maps, they did aerial maps. Now, what are aerial maps? Well, basically, they just would go up in a plane, take a picture of the ground, and archive it. And they did this pretty much since the time of airplanes. Sometimes for cartography purposes, but sometimes just for historic stuff. I'm not sure where they get these maps. So I needed a map for 1989. They didn't have one for this particular town, but they had one for 1987. So I could be sure that anything on the 1987 map was probably still there in 1989, and I could compare it to, I think there was a 90 map if I really was worried that it was gone. But I was mostly worried about things like parks. Certain parks got built up or changed in this particular town. Certain businesses. Now, there's not a lot of, it's not an interactive Google map, an aerial map, so they don't have every building and business. So it was more like, as you go but further back in time, you can't check that closely. But there's certain buildings in the town, government buildings, that I was able to confirm. Oh yeah, that was there. That's been there since, there was one building that's been there since 1914, which I figures prominently in the book. And I think I mentioned it on the Piney podcast on yesterday, which should have been Sunday. I was going to say Sunday, but I actually did that on Monday. So you can watch the Piney podcast if you want to know the town I'm talking about. But it was kind of hard because you have to make sure it was there in '89 in my case, but stuff disappears. So, one of the things I looked up was a certain ghost. There's a ghost, according to legend, of a mayor from this town that I set the Pineys, book 19 in. Now, the legend was he died of a heart attack on his last day in office, and he now haunts City Hall, which was perfect for the book. And I said, "Ooh, I'm going to use that." And I actually wrote the scene with the mayor ghost, and or at least a draft of it. But then I was like, I wonder what year he died, because I wanted to describe the ghost and the clothes that the ghost was wearing. Because I thought, oh, maybe, because this town's pretty old, it goes back to the 1800s, I think. So it could have been cool to have him all, in Victorian dress or whatever. So I started looking it up, and I wasn't finding any information on the ghost specifically, which was very frustrating. And then finally, I was just about to just leave it in the book. I said, well, I know the story exists. I'll just leave it in there. I think it's an old an old mayor or whatever. That sounds about right. And then I came up with a way to search for it that I could finally, because then I figured, well, if it happened in recent history, then they would definitely have a record of it in the newspaper, you know? So if somebody, or online, because if somebody died, let's say in the 2000s of a heart attack and they were a government official, they would have an article. So sure enough, I did the search in a different way, and boom, it popped up. And it turned out this mayor died in 1992. And then I realized, oh, I cannot use this ghost because he's not there for another 3 years. Fortunately, the area is haunted by more than one ghost. I mentioned the building from 1914. There's some ghosts there. So I used one of the ghosts from there. Again, I couldn't find a specific year for that, but I'm pretty sure I'm okay on that front. It's a little more vague, the ghost story, so that one I could tweak a little bit. But I definitely couldn't use the mayor one. So I switched it to a different ghost, and that's part of the problem with doing this research in a more recent era of history. Things again like the Revolutionary War. I mean, you've got everything. You got every time George Washington ate a sandwich, you know what time he did it. But when it comes to and look, the history I'm researching, it's not in this particular area. It's not particularly important, right? The Revolutionary War was super important. That's why there's so much data on it. They're constantly, to this day, they're finding out new information about the Revolutionary War. In 1989, they're not really digging up anything, trying to figure out what happened in 1989. They just look back in the archives, and that's about it. Yeah, that's kind of the difference. And there's another historical thing in the story about a shipwreck that took place in the early 1900s, I'll say, right around the same era. So there was fairly good data on that. A lot of conspiracy theories around it. So at least enough that I could write the story. So I went forward with that. But the 1989 stuff was one of the reasons I was having so much trouble finishing book 19 is I was constantly stopping and starting to make sure certain movies, certain music was out when the characters make reference to it. Because if it's not, then they can't make reference to it if a movie hadn't come out. If a movie came out in 1990, none of the characters have seen it in 1989. It just wouldn't have been a thing. So it was a bit of a challenge, and fortunately, I'm writing a lot of comedy in the Pineys, and I have a lot of leeway with that. If I mess something up or things aren't totally accurate, it's fine, but I'm trying to be as accurate as possible. In fact, my girlfriend went like, "Why are you doing so much research?" And I was like, "Nah, I'm trying to get as close as possible." I'm trying to really, with the book series, show South Jersey and showcase everything about South Jersey. So, I'm trying to get as close to everything as possible. And, so it was a real challenge. And, of course, for 1989, I wanted more detail, right? Now, in other eras, the 1800s or the early 1900s, you don't need all that much knowledge. Let's say you can sort of fill in the gaps yourself, as long as you don't make any big mistakes, like with the technology, or something like that. You can get away with different aspects, I would say. As long as you don't do something like put a fleet of trucks in the late 1800s, right? Because the trucks probably didn't exist. That wasn't really until the early 1900s that you get a lot of trucks. So these are the kinds of things you got to think about when you're doing research and when you're writing in a particular era. And the research pays off. The research pays off, I think, when people read your book and they get a feel for a time period and it feels authentic. And, you know, you don't want people to come back and say, oh, you made a big mistake here. They didn't have that technology in that period of time. And then you're like, oh my God, what have I done? I've made a huge mistake. Of course, these days with the way it's so easy to upload your book to Amazon, you can actually correct that mistake and re-upload the book, and then all the subsequent copies will be fine. But it's better to get it right the first time, I say. Get it right the first time. That's the main thing. And that's it for me, Tony D and Little Jones somewhere behind me. If you have a question or a topic you'd like me to cover on the channel regarding writing or screenwriting or whatever, even anything, feel free to put it in the comments below. I have a wonderful new follower who's constantly giving me tips on trailers I should be looking at, so I've been doing that. So doing a lot of members request, not members only, but members request. So if you have a request, feel free to put it in the comments. Check me out Saturday at the Scary Book Fest, 12 to 8:30 at Flemington, New Jersey's Act 2 Books. Hope to see you there. See you in the next one.